The rain had been falling since late afternoon, a slow drizzle at first, turning into a steady downpour by the time I reached the cabin. The drive up had been rough, 30 miles of winding roads, most of them gravel, and another 3 miles of dirt trail that was barely passable after the storm earlier in the week. The tires of my truck slid more than once on the muddy ruts, but I made it. I killed the engine and listened to the rain hammering against the windshield, the sound rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The forest was dark around me, thick trees stretching in every direction, their tops swaying under the wind. The place was isolated, which was the whole point. I needed the time alone, a few days of quiet, away from work, away from the city, away from everything. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit immediately. It was late October, and up here in the mountains, the temperature dropped fast once the sun set. The cabin sat about 50 yards from where I'd parked, just a simple structure, nothing fancy. One room, a wood stove, a cot, and a small table with a couple of chairs. It had been my grandfather's, a hunting cabin he built back in the 60s. I made my way up the steps, boots slipping a little on the wet wood. The key was under the second step, exactly where it had always been. I let myself in, shaking the rain from my jacket. The air inside was stale, the smell of old wood and dust thick. I set my bag down and pulled out the flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar space. The stove was in the far corner, a stack of firewood beside it. The cot, covered in an old plaid blanket, sat against the wall. There was a small counter with a sink, though the plumbing hadn't worked in years. A few shelves held some canned goods, likely long expired. I sighed, locking the door behind me. The first order of business was getting a fire going. I stacked the wood, stuffed some crumpled newspaper underneath, and struck a match. The flames caught, flickering, casting long shadows against the walls. I warmed my hands over the heat, letting the cold seep from my bones. Outside, the rain poured harder. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the old cabin creak. I pulled out a small camping stove from my bag, set it up on the table, and heated a can of soup. The smell filled the cabin, something comforting in the simplicity of it. I ate quickly, listening to the storm rage on. By the time I finished, the fire had settled into a steady burn. I leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth spread through me. The wind was relentless now, hammering against the walls, shaking the window panes. I closed my eyes, exhaling. Then I heard it, a sound just barely audible over the storm. A thud. I opened my eyes, listening. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe an animal had knocked something over outside. The wind made it hard to tell. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, moving to the window. The glass was fogged from the warmth inside, but I wiped it with my sleeve, peering out. Darkness. The trees swayed violently, rain slashing through the air in thick sheets. The truck was still where I left it, partially hidden by the trees. The forest beyond was just a mass of shadows, shifting under the wind. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, something felt off. I turned away from the window, but then another sound came. This one closer. A shuffling noise, like footsteps over wet leaves. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I wasn't supposed to be alone out here. My first thought was an animal. A deer maybe, or a bear, though it was late in the season for them to be wandering this low. But I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between an animal's movement and something else. I reached for the hunting rifle mounted on the wall, my fingers tightening around the stock. I hadn't planned on needing it, but I was glad it was there. Then another noise, a creak, this time from the porch. I raised the rifle, heart pounding now. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as I moved toward the door. The cabin had no peephole, just a window beside the door. I took slow steps, every creak of the wooden floor loud in my ears. I pressed my back against the wall beside the window, took a breath, and then, in one quick motion, turned and shone the flashlight outside. Nothing. The porch was empty, but the feeling didn't leave me, that deep, instinctive sense that someone was out there. I waited, standing still, breathing slow, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. The storm howled around me. Then I saw it, barely visible at the edge of the tree line. A figure, standing motionless in the rain. A man. He was facing the cabin, though I couldn't make out his face. He stood just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, his body dark against the backdrop of trees. I gripped the rifle tighter. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, staring at him. Maybe a few seconds, maybe a full minute. My heart hammered so loud I could hear it in my ears. Then he took a step forward. Slow, deliberate. I raised the rifle, not aiming yet, but making it clear that I was armed. The man stopped. The rain poured down between us. I wanted to shout something, but my throat was dry. Then he did something that sent ice through my veins. He turned and walked back into the trees. Not running, not hurrying, just walking, like he had all the time in the world. I waited, breath shallow, until I could no longer see him, but I knew he was still out there. For hours, I stayed awake, rifle across my lap, listening. The fire crackled, the storm raged on, but I heard nothing else. By dawn, the rain had eased. I stepped outside, rifle still in hand, scanning the woods. The ground was soaked, puddles forming in the dips of earth, leaves scattered everywhere. But near the edge of the tree line, I saw them. Footprints, leading to the cabin, and then away. I never saw him again, never found out who he was or what he wanted. But I packed my things that morning and left, and I never went back to that cabin again. That was just one experience, but it stayed with me. I still think about that night sometimes. The rain, the wind, the way he stood there watching, and the way he left without a word. It was late November, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones even when the air was still. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a solo hunting weekend deep in the woods of northern Montana. The land belonged to an old friend of my dad's, a retired logger who had built a small cabin out there decades ago. I'd been given permission to stay there while I hunted, but I wasn't expecting much in terms of comfort. I just needed a dry place to sleep and somewhere to keep warm at night. I left early on a Friday morning, the truck packed with everything I needed: rifle, ammo, sleeping bag, food, and enough firewood to last a few nights. The drive took longer than expected. The main roads were fine, but the last stretch was a nightmare. A narrow dirt trail led into the trees, winding up and down steep hills, made worse by the recent rain. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sky was already turning gray, hinting at an early sunset. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. A single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table pushed against one wall. It smelled like damp wood and old dust, like it hadn't been used in months. There was no electricity, no running water, just a roof over my head and walls to keep the wind out. It was enough. I spent the first couple of hours setting up, unpacking, stacking firewood near the door, and checking over my rifle. By the time I stepped outside to take a look around, the sun was already slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The silence was heavy, the kind you only find deep in the wilderness. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. That night, I ate a quick meal, stoked the fire, and lay down on the cot, staring at the ceiling while the wind pushed against the cabin walls. I didn't sleep well, Not because I was scared, just restless. The kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a place that doesn't quite feel like yours. The next morning, I was up before dawn. The cold bit through my jacket as I hiked out to a ridge I had scouted on the map, looking for deer sign. The woods were quiet except for the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I found a decent spot near a fallen tree and settled in, waiting for movement. Hours passed. The wind picked up, sending dry leaves tumbling across the ground. I saw tracks, old ones, but nothing fresh. By midday, I was ready to move. I hiked deeper, following a narrow game trail that led through a dense patch of trees. That's when I saw it. A second cabin, smaller than mine, almost hidden in the undergrowth. I wasn't expecting another structure out here. The maps hadn't shown anything, and the landowner hadn't mentioned it. It looked abandoned, the door slightly ajar, the wood gray and rotting. I stepped closer, pushing aside the tall grass. The inside was empty. No furniture, no signs of recent use. Just a broken window and leaves scattered across the floor. I stood there for a while, listening. There was something unsettling about it, something that made me feel watched. Maybe it was just the isolation, the way the wind funneled through the trees, making the whole place feel alive. I didn't stay long. By the time I got back to my cabin, the sun was dipping low again. I was tired, frustrated at the lack of game, but I still had another day ahead of me. I made dinner, stoked the fire, and lay back down on the cot, trying to push the image of that second cabin out of my mind. Sometime in the night, I woke up, not to a sound, just a feeling, a heaviness in the air, like something wasn't right. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I sat up, listening. The wind had died down, leaving nothing but silence. Then footsteps, not close but not far either, somewhere out in the trees. Slow, deliberate. I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the woods were silent again. Maybe an animal, maybe my mind playing tricks. But I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt near the tree line. Not deer, not anything I could easily explain. Human. They led toward the second cabin. I followed them, rifle in hand. The tracks were fresh, the damp earth still soft where they had pressed in. They stopped near the open doorway of the abandoned cabin. I stepped inside again, scanning the empty space. That's when I saw it, something new. A pile of ashes in the corner, faint but recent, like someone had built a fire there in the last day or two. Someone had been here. I left quickly, making my way back to my own cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I had another night ahead of me, but my gut told me to leave. That evening, as the light faded, I packed up. I kept the fire burning, kept my rifle close, but I didn't sleep. Every creak of the trees, every shift in the wind put me on edge. I waited for the footsteps to return, but the night passed in silence. The first light, I was gone. I loaded the truck, double-checked my gear, and started down the muddy trail. As I drove past the tree line, I glanced back one last time at the cabin. Nothing moved, nothing changed, just an empty clearing, a place that felt like it had been waiting for something. I never told the landowner what I saw. Maybe he already knew. Maybe that second cabin wasn't supposed to be there at all. But I never went back, and I never hunted alone again. I never liked driving long distances at night, especially through areas I wasn't familiar with. Something about the dark, empty roads always made me uneasy. But that night, I had no choice. I had been working on a project in a small town a few hours away, and it had taken longer than expected. I was exhausted, and the thought of sleeping in my own bed pushed me to keep going. The highway was mostly empty, with only the occasional pair of headlights passing by. The only sound was the steady hum of my engine and the occasional thud of tires hitting small potholes. I checked the time, just past midnight. I figured I had another hour or so to go. But then, as I glanced at my fuel gauge, I realized I had made a mistake. I had barely a quarter tank left. I should have filled up before I left. The next gas station was miles back, and I wasn't sure when I'd find another. My GPS wasn't much help, showing nothing but a long stretch of road ahead with no clear indication of a station nearby. Then I saw it, a small green road sign, weathered and bent at the edges. It pointed toward a side road, with cabins and fuel, 5 miles, written in faded white letters. I hesitated for a second, but decided to take the exit. 5 miles wasn't far, and I wasn't in the mood to push my luck running on fumes. The road was narrow and rough, with thick trees lining both sides. My headlights barely cut through the darkness. Felt like I was driving into nowhere. I kept going, watching the mileage tick up. After what felt longer than 5 miles, I finally saw a light ahead. A small wooden sign stood near the road, its paint peeling. "Howard's Cabins and Gas," it read. Behind it was a cabin, dimly lit by an old porch light. There were no other cars, no movement, nothing. I pulled up next to the single gas pump, cutting the engine. It looked old, probably hadn't been replaced in decades. I got out and tried to activate the pump, but nothing happened. No beeping, no sign of it even being operational. I looked around, feeling the weight of the silence. There were no sounds except for the rustling of trees in the wind. I stepped up onto the wooden porch and knocked on the cabin door. The wood was rough, splintered in places. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle. The door wasn't locked. I shouldn't have gone inside, but I did. The air inside smelled stale, like dust and old wood. A single bulb flickered above a wooden counter. The room was small, cluttered with papers, an old cash register, and a few shelves of canned food and supplies. It looked more like an old general store than a gas station. I stepped forward, my boots creaking against the wooden floor. "Hello," I called out instinctively, but my voice just disappeared into the space. I scanned the room. There was a small doorway behind the counter, leading further back into the cabin. Something about it felt wrong. There was an uneaten plate of food on the counter, covered in dust. A cup of coffee next to it had long since dried up, leaving only a dark ring on the wood. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, and they hadn't come back. A noise broke the silence, something shifting outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, careful movement. I turned toward the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't alone. I stepped back from the counter, moving as quietly as I could. I needed to leave, now. But then I saw it. A door near the back, slightly open. Beyond it, a staircase led downward. A basement. Everything in me told me to get out, to run. But my body refused to move. A part of me needed to know what was down there. Why would a gas station have a basement? I took a step forward, then another. The stairs groaned under my weight. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell became, something damp and rotting. My breath caught in my throat. Then I saw it. A row of old metal cages lined the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. Chains hung from the ceiling. There was dried blood on the floor, dark stains that had seeped into the concrete. My stomach turned. Footsteps. Above me, someone was in the cabin. I turned and ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time. As I reached the top, I caught a glimpse through the window. A figure stood just beyond the porch, partially hidden in the trees. Watching, I didn't stop. I bolted for my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands shook as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. My headlights lit up the trees ahead, and for a brief moment, I saw them. More figures, standing just beyond the tree line. Too many. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires kicking up dirt as I sped back down the narrow road. My hands were locked onto the wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I saw the glow of a real gas station ahead, miles away from that place. I pulled in, my heart still hammering. The attendant looked at me, probably noticing the way I was breathing hard, my hands still shaking. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, but I knew the truth. I didn't know what I had found back there, but someone had built that place for a reason, and I had been inches away from finding out exactly what that reason was, and I never wanted to know. It was supposed to be a quiet few days away from everything. That was the plan. I had been feeling burnt out from work. Just constant deadlines, constant stress, barely any sleep. My head felt like it was always buzzing, my body worn out. I needed space. So, I rented a cabin out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Australian bush, about 5 hours from Sydney. It was isolated, no reception, and surrounded by dense trees and winding dirt roads. The nearest town was a good hour's drive away, just a tiny speck on the map with a petrol station and a general store. That was fine. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to clear my head. The cabin itself was simple, made of old timber, sitting on a slight incline with a small front porch and a tin roof. It looked sturdy, though weathered, the wood darkened with age and the roof speckled with rust. There was a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with an old shower that rattled when you turned it on. Power came from a solar battery and a backup generator, and water was from a rain tank out the back. No TV, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the bushland. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting golden light through the trees, making long shadows stretch across the dry, uneven ground. The air smelled like eucalyptus, a crisp, earthy scent that made my lungs feel clear for the first time in weeks. I unpacked, locked the car, and settled in. There wasn't much to do that first night. I made some food, sat on the porch for a while, and just listened. The bush was alive with sounds. Birds calling out, leaves rustling in the wind, distant chirps of insects. Felt peaceful. I thought for the first time in a long time that maybe this trip had been a good idea. Then, just as I was heading inside, I heard something. It wasn't an animal noise, not like the others. It was subtle, almost too soft to notice over the other sounds, but I caught it. A light crunch of gravel, like a footstep. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. It was probably just the wind knocking a branch loose, maybe a wallaby moving through the scrub. I told myself not to overthink it. I locked the door, checked the windows, and went to bed. The second day, I woke early. The sun was bright, the sky a clear blue. It was warm, the kind of dry heat that made your skin feel tight. I spent most of the morning outside, exploring a little, walking through the trees. The land stretched out for miles, rugged and wild, untouched except for the narrow dirt road leading in. It was beautiful, but there was something about it that made me feel small, like I didn't quite belong there. I saw animal tracks in the dirt, some old, some fresh. Kangaroo, maybe, a few small burrows. Nothing unusual. But then, a little further from the cabin, I found something strange. A footprint. It was deep, clear in the dry soil. Not an animal, but a person. A bare foot, large, maybe a man's. The toes pressed firm into the dirt. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. It hadn't rained in at least a week, so it had to be recent. That was odd. I hadn't seen anyone since I got there. There were no houses nearby, no hiking trails, nothing. Just endless bushland. I tried to ignore it, but the thought stuck with me. That night, I was more aware of the sounds outside. The usual hum of insects, the occasional rustle in the trees. I told myself it was just the normal noises of the wild, but my mind kept going back to that footprint. Then, at some point late at night, I heard something again. A thud. Not inside the cabin. Outside. It was close, somewhere near the porch. I held my breath, listening, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was another sound, a slow, deliberate step on the wooden boards outside. Someone was there. I stayed still. The cabin had no curtains, and the moon was bright, casting pale light through the trees. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. The steps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard them move again. This time, slowly, stepping off the porch. The sound faded, swallowed by the night. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal, maybe a possum or a dingo sniffing around. I forced myself to shake it off. I stepped outside. The sun was warm, the air still. Everything looked normal. But then I saw it. On the porch, right near the door. Footprint. The same size as the one I had found in the dirt, but fresh this time. Pressed into the fine layer of dust on the wooden boards. I felt cold despite the heat. Someone had been there, watching, standing right outside my door. I decided I was done. I didn't care how peaceful I had wanted this trip to be. I packed my things fast, shoving them into my bag, throwing everything into the car. As I locked up the cabin, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it. Far, deep in the trees past the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't wait. I got in the car and drove, speeding down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind me. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Hours later, when I finally reached the highway, my heart was still racing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just the open road stretching ahead. I never went back to that cabin, never told anyone about what happened, and I never stopped wondering who or what had been out there with me. I used to believe that danger had a certain look, a way of making itself known before it struck. But I was wrong. Real danger doesn't come with a warning. It hides in plain sight, blending into the background of everyday life, waiting for the perfect moment to show itself. I learned that the hard way one cold autumn when I agreed to help my old friend, Mark, fix up his family's hunting cabin deep in the woods of Montana. Mark and I had known each other since high school, though we had drifted apart in recent years. When he called me out of the blue, asking if I wanted to join him for a few weeks to work on the place, I hesitated. I had nothing better to do, though, and the idea of getting away from everything for a while seemed appealing. The drive out to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. The further I went, the more isolated the roads became. Eventually, I was on dirt paths barely wide enough for my truck, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The sun was already sinking below the horizon by the time I arrived. The cabin itself was a small, weathered structure, half hidden by towering pines. It had a single front door, a few narrow windows, and a wraparound porch that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The roof sagged slightly, and the whole place smelled of damp wood and mildew. Mark was waiting for me outside, grinning as he waved me over. We spent the first few days clearing out the cabin, hauling away broken furniture and cleaning up the dust and debris that had built up over the years. The place had no electricity, only an old generator that sputtered and whined whenever we tried to use it. Nights were spent by the fireplace, the only source of heat in the entire building. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and making the walls groan. It wasn't until the fourth day that I started to notice something was off. It began with small things. The feeling of being watched whenever I stepped outside. The way the woods seemed too quiet, like even the animals were hiding. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wasn't used to being this deep in the wilderness. But the unease wouldn't go away. One afternoon, while I was chopping wood behind the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. Buried beneath a pile of old logs was a rusted hunting knife, its blade dark with what looked like dried blood. The handle was cracked, the leather worn from years of exposure to the elements. I brought it inside to show Mark, but he just shrugged. "Probably just an old tool someone left behind," he said. "People have been coming up here for years to hunt." I wasn't convinced. Something about the knife felt wrong. I ended up taking it outside and burying it again, deeper this time. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought it was Mark, maybe stepping outside to use the bathroom. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate steps moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear over the wind. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Then, just as I was about to lie back down, something scraped against the wooden walls outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like nails being pulled across the surface. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on, casting a weak glow around the room. The shadows stretched long and thin across the floor, shifting as the fire flickered in the hearth. I turned toward the window. For a brief second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape standing just beyond the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. The next morning, I told Mark what I had heard. "Probably just an animal," he said, brushing it off. "There are bears and mountain lions out here. You shouldn't be so jumpy." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I made sure to secure the door before going to sleep. I wedged a chair under the handle and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of creaking floorboards. Inside the cabin, I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room in near darkness. I listened, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound came again, soft, careful footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Someone was inside. I barely dared to breathe as I reached for the hunting knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. My fingers closed around the handle, slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. I couldn't see who it was, but I could feel them there, standing in the darkness, watching me. I stayed completely still, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The next morning, I found the front door slightly ajar. I didn't tell Mark. I knew he wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. But that day, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if Mark wanted to stay. Something was wrong with that place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. That afternoon, while Mark was out gathering firewood, I packed my things. I loaded everything into my truck and got behind the wheel, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I turned the key. Nothing happened. I tried again. The engine sputtered but wouldn't start. I popped the hood, stepping outside to check the battery. That's when I saw it. The wires had been cut. Panic surged through me. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone didn't want me to leave. I sprinted back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I grabbed the shotgun Mark kept by the fireplace, my hands shaking as I loaded it. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the floor. That's when I saw movement outside. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the fading light. They weren't moving, just watching. I raised the shotgun, aiming it at the figure. They took a step closer. I fired. The shot echoed through the trees, sending birds flying into the sky. The figure didn't fall. They didn't even flinch. Then they vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, Mark was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots missing. I searched the woods for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had disappeared without a trace. I never found out what happened to him. Eventually, a passing hunter found me wandering the woods, half out of my mind with exhaustion. I told him everything, but when we returned to the cabin, it was empty.
No footprints.
No signs of a struggle. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But I know what I saw, and I know that someone is still out there watching. I never believed in things like skinwalkers. I had heard stories, mostly from old folks in small towns, but they always felt like something out of a bad horror movie. Just stories meant to scare kids or entertain people around a fire. I figured if anything was lurking in the deep woods, it was just wolves, bears, or maybe some crazy person living off the grid. That belief changed in 2017. It was early November, cold enough for frost, but not quite winter yet. The days were short, the nights long. I had taken time off work to clear my head. A friend of mine had a small hunting cabin in the mountains of Montana, miles away from anything. He told me I could use it anytime I wanted, so I did. I had been there once before, years ago, and I remembered how isolated it was. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and a well for water. It was exactly what I needed. I packed enough food for a week, grabbed my rifle just in case I ran into any wildlife, and made the long drive out. The road was rough, nothing but dirt and gravel. After about 4 hours of driving, I finally saw the small, weathered cabin tucked between tall pine trees. It looked exactly as I remembered: single room, wooden walls, a small porch with an old rocking chair. I parked, grabbed my gear, and stepped inside. The air was stale, cold. Dust had settled on the wooden floor, and the fireplace was filled with old ash. I spent the next hour cleaning, getting a fire going, and unpacking my supplies. That first night was uneventful. I sat outside for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was peaceful in a way, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. The second night is when things changed. I had spent the day hiking, exploring the area, making sure there weren't any signs of bears nearby. By the time I got back, the sun was setting and the temperature had dropped fast. I got the fire going, made a quick meal, and sat outside on the porch. That's when I heard something. At first, it was faint, just the sound of branches snapping deep in the woods. Probably an animal, I thought. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't moving like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I stood up, grabbing my rifle. The footsteps stopped. The woods went silent. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just shadows stretching between the trunks. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. Soft, slow footsteps circled the cabin. My heart pounded as I reached for my rifle. The fire had burned low, leaving the room in near darkness. I sat up, listening, waiting. Then, something tapped on the window. I froze. The window was small, high up on the wall. Whatever was outside had to be tall, too tall. The tapping came again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, in the dim light, I saw something shift past the window. A shadow, but not the shape of an animal. It was standing upright, I gripped my rifle tighter. The footsteps moved to the front door. I heard slow, shallow breathing just on the other side of the wood. Then something scratched the door. It wasn't frantic like an animal trying to get in. It was controlled, almost testing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, rifle in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I opened the door. The ground was covered in frost, except for a set of footprints leading from the tree line to my porch. They weren't normal. They looked human, almost, but the toes were too long, the shape just slightly wrong. I wanted to believe they were just some strange trick of the frost. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I packed my things. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I had my rifle and I was overreacting. I stayed. The third night was worse. I forced myself to sleep. I figured if something wanted to break in, it would have already. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had gone out. The cabin was dark, and something was inside with me. I could hear it breathing low, ragged, not like an animal, not like a person, something in between. I didn't move. Then I heard it shift. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor. I couldn't see it. The darkness was too thick. Then it spoke. It mimicked my own breathing. A slow, broken inhale, a matching exhale, almost like it was trying to learn how to be human. Then it stopped, and for the first time, I felt like it was staring right at me. The door was only a few feet away. My rifle was in my hands, but I knew that if I made a sound, it would move before I could react. So I waited. I don't know how long, maybe an hour, maybe more. Then, just as slowly as it came, it left. I heard the door creak open. The air outside was still, and then silence. When the sun finally rose, I left everything behind. My bag, my gear, even my rifle. I didn't care. I ran to my truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. It took me years to talk about what happened. Even now, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was a person, maybe it was an animal, maybe it was something else. But one thing still haunts me. As I was driving away, I glanced at my rearview mirror, and I saw it, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. It was the same height as a person, the same shape, but the way it stood, the way its head tilted slightly, too unnatural. It wasn't human. And the worst part? It smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. And then it turned and vanished into the woods. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my friend about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that smile, and I wonder if it ever really let me leave. I never thought that night would be my last in that cabin. When I first arrived, it felt like a good place to clear my head. A simple wooden structure deep in the forest, a place to get away from the noise of the world. The trees surrounded it like a natural fortress, their branches stretching high, blocking out most of the sky. I had been staying there for nearly a week, alone, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the undergrowth. But that last night, something felt different. I had noticed it earlier in the day, that unsettling quiet. Normally, the forest was alive with sounds. Birds calling, squirrels rustling in the leaves, the distant crack of tree branches. But that day, it was as if everything had gone still. Even the wind had died down, leaving only an unnatural silence. I ignored it, convincing myself it was nothing. I spent most of the day collecting firewood, making sure I had enough to last the night. The sun was already dipping behind the trees by the time I was done. I cooked a simple meal over the small stove in the cabin, ate quickly, and sat outside for a while, watching the forest turn dark. I had been keeping a small lantern with me, its dim glow casting flickering shadows across the trees. It wasn't until I was about to go inside that I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. I had walked around the cabin earlier, gathering wood, leaving my own prints in the damp soil. But these were different. They were fresh, and they weren't mine. The shape was slightly off, the spacing between them uneven, as if whoever made them was moving cautiously. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into the trees. That was when the first wave of unease hit me. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through, maybe someone who hadn't seen the cabin until they got close. But that didn't explain why they had come so close and then disappeared. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I locked the door when I went back inside. Normally, I wouldn't have, but something about those footprints didn't sit right with me. The lock was old, just a simple latch, but it made me feel slightly better. I stoked the fire, letting the warmth fill the cabin, and sat down in the old wooden chair near the fireplace. Hours passed. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that I had probably left those footprints myself earlier in the day and just hadn't noticed them. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the unease didn't leave me. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves, like a footstep. I froze, listening. The fire crackled beside me, but beyond that, the world outside was silent again. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound, but it never came. I stood up slowly and grabbed the flashlight from the table. I didn't want to go outside, but I had to know if someone was out there. I moved to the window, keeping my movements slow and quiet. I didn't turn on the flashlight yet. Instead, I peered through the glass, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness. Nothing. The forest was just as still as before, the trees barely moving. But something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I stayed by the window for a long time, watching. Then I turned back toward the door, and my blood went cold. The latch on the door had moved. It hadn't been fully unlatched, but it was clear that something had disturbed it. My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't heard the door move, hadn't felt the cabin shift, but something had tried to get inside. I moved quickly, grabbing the heaviest thing I could find. A rusty old axe that had been left in the cabin by whoever had stayed here before me. I held it tight in my hands, my breathing slow and controlled, and backed into the farthest corner of the room. For what felt like hours, I waited. Every sound, every creak of the wooden walls, every shift of the wind outside made my muscles tighten. I kept my eyes locked on the door, expecting it to move at any moment, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over. My body was tense, my mind running in circles, but my eyes grew heavy. I didn't want to sleep. I fought it as long as I could, but at some point, I must have drifted off. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up again. It was the sound that pulled me from sleep, a slow, dragging sound just outside the cabin. I snapped awake, gripping the axe even tighter. My body was stiff, my neck sore from sleeping in such an awkward position. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long shadows against the walls. I listened. The dragging sound was moving around the cabin, slow and steady. Then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Then, from the window, I saw it. A figure. It was just outside, barely visible in the darkness. The shape was wrong, slightly hunched, its arms hanging too low. It stood there, unmoving. I stared at it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I gripped the axe tighter, my knuckles turning white. Then slowly it moved, not toward the door, not away, just shifting slightly, as if testing the air, waiting for something. I knew I couldn't stay there. If it had tried to get in once, it would try again. I had to leave. But I couldn't just run. I needed a plan. The only way out was through the front door. I moved as quietly as I could, grabbing my bag and slinging it over my shoulder. I kept the axe in my hand, my fingers wrapped tightly around the handle. The figure outside hadn't moved again. I could still see it standing there watching. I took a deep breath. Then I moved. I unlatched the door in one quick motion and shoved it open, stepping outside before I could change my mind. The cold air hit me like a wall. The figure was gone. I didn't stop to think. I started moving toward the trees, my steps careful but fast. I didn't look back. I just kept moving. I knew that if I saw it again, if it was still watching, I wouldn't be able to keep going. The forest was darker than I had ever seen it. My flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows. Every sound made my nerves jump, but I didn't stop. I walked for what felt like hours, the cabin shrinking behind me. The whole time, I felt like something was just behind me, moving through the trees, keeping its distance. By the time I reached my car, the sky was beginning to lighten. I didn't hesitate. I threw my bag into the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove until the trees thinned out, until the road became familiar again, until I was sure that whatever had been out there wasn't following me anymore. That was my last night in that cabin. I never went back.